In the beginning, there was silence. For hundreds of thousands of years, human thoughts, dreams, laws, and stories existed only in the moment they were spoken, vanishing into air as soon as the words left the speaker's lips. Memory was the only record, and when a person died, their knowledge died with them. Then, sometime around 3400 BCE, in the marshy plains between two great rivers in what is now southern Iraq, someone made a mark on a clay tablet that would change the course of human history forever. The Sumerians had invented writing, and in doing so, they transformed humanity from a species bound by the limits of memory into one that could preserve knowledge across generations, communicate across distances, and build civilizations of unprecedented complexity. This is the story of Sumer, the world's first literate civilization, a people who gave us writing, mathematics, law, literature, and the very concept of the city, yet whose language fell silent, whose cities turned to dust, and whose very existence was forgotten for over 2,000 years, until archaeologists pulled their words from the earth and gave voice once again to humanity's first writers. Our story begins not with kings or conquests, but with accounting. In the late 4th millennium BCE, the inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, faced a problem that would drive one of history's greatest innovations. Their settlements were growing rapidly, transforming from villages into the world's first cities. Uruk, the largest, may have housed 50 Sero people at 3000 BCE, a population density unimaginable in the scattered farming communities that had dominated human existence the previous 4,000 years. With urbanization came complexity. Temple institutions controlled vast agricultural estates, workshops produced goods for trade, and administrators needed to track inventories, rations, workers, and transactions involving thousands of items and hundreds of people. Human memory, which had served small communities adequately, could not possibly manage this flood of information. The solution emerged gradually. Administrators began using small clay tokens of various shapes to represent different commodities. A cone for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a large measure, an egg shape for oil, a cylinder for animals. These tokens could be grouped and counted, creating a physical representation of abstract quantities. But tokens had limitations. They could be lost, mixed up, or fraudulently altered. So around 3400 BCE, the Sumerians developed a more permanent solution. They began enclosing tokens in hollow clay envelopes, creating secure records of transactions. But this created a new problem. You could not see what was inside without breaking the envelope. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Before sealing the envelope, they pressed the tokens into the soft clay surface, creating impressions that showed what was inside. And then someone realized something profound. If you have the impressions on the outside, you do not need the tokens on the inside at all. The symbol had become more important than the thing it represented. Abstract, written notation had been born. These earliest written documents were purely economic, simple lists and counts rendered in pictographic symbols pressed into clay with a reed stylus. A picture of a head meant head, or by extension, ration. A picture of a bowl meant food, or to eat. But the system expanded rapidly. Within a few generations, Sumerian scribes were combining symbols to create new meanings, and using symbols not just for the objects they depicted, but for the sounds of their names, allowing them to write abstract concepts that could not be pictured. By 3000 BCE, they had developed cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge, named for the distinctive wedge-shaped marks made by pressing the edge of a reed stylus into wet clay. Cuneiform could record not just inventories, but names, places, actions, and eventually the full complexity of human language and thought. The implications were staggering. For the first time in human history, a thought could outlive the thinker. Knowledge could accumulate across generations. A king could send orders to generals 100 miles away. A priest could preserve sacred knowledge exactly, without the distortions of oral transmission. Laws could be written down for all to see, rather than existing only in the memory of judges. Writing did not just record civilization, it made complex civilization possible. The Sumerians used their new tool with extraordinary creativity. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian scribes were producing not just administrative records, but literature, history, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and more. They created the world's first written literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving great work of literary fiction, which explores themes of friendship, mortality, the search for meaning, and the limits of human power with a sophistication that still resonates today. They developed sophisticated mathematics, inventing the sexagesimal number system based on the number 60, which is why we still divide our hours into 60 minutes and our minutes into 60 seconds over 4,000 years later. They created detailed astronomical records, tracking the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision. They wrote down laws, medical texts, proverbs, hymns, myths, historical chronicles, and personal letters. The scope of Sumerian intellectual achievement in just a few centuries of literacy is breathtaking, but writing was only one of Sumer's revolutionary innovations. The Sumerians invented or pioneered so many fundamental aspects of civilization that our modern world is built on Sumerian foundations we rarely acknowledge. They created the concept of the city itself as a political and economic unit. Before Sumer, humans lived in villages and tribal groups. The Sumerians built genuine urban centers, Ur and Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, each an independent city-state with tens of thousands of inhabitants, monumental architecture, specialized labor, social hierarchy, and centralized administration. They invented the wheel, not for transportation initially, but for pottery production, only later adapting it to create wheeled vehicles that revolutionized trade and warfare. They developed bronze metallurgy, mixing copper and tin to create a metal harder than either component, launching the Bronze Age, and transforming tools, weapons, and art. They pioneered irrigation agriculture on a massive scale, building canals and dikes that transformed the arid Mesopotamian plain into agricultural paradise, producing surplus grain that could feed urban populations and support specialized workers. The Sumerians created organized religion as we know it, building massive temple complexes called ziggurats, stepped pyramids that dominated city skylines and served as centers of religious, economic, and political power. The ziggurat at Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, still stands partially today, its mud brick core surviving 4 years of weather and war. These temples were not just places of worship, but economic powerhouses, controlling vast estates, employing hundreds of workers, and functioning as banks, granaries, and redistributive centers. The priests who managed these institutions were among the first professional administrators, and the need to manage temple resources drove much of Sumerian innovation in writing, mathematics, and bureaucracy. Religion permeated every aspect of Sumerian life. They believed that humans had been created to serve the gods, that each city belonged to a particular deity who protected it, and that the king ruled as the earthly representative of divine authority. This fusion of religious and political power would influence Near Eastern civilization for millennia. The Sumerians also gave us the first written law codes, establishing the principle that law should be public, written, and applied consistently, rather than varying by the whim of individual rulers. The earliest known legal code, the Code of Ur dating to around 2100 BCE, prescribed specific punishments for specific crimes and established the revolutionary concept that justice could be achieved through monetary compensation rather than pure revenge. If a man commits a murder, that man must be killed, it declares. But also, if a man knocks out the eye of another man, he shall weigh out half a mina of silver. The principle that law should be written, public, and predictable rather than arbitrary and oral, was a Sumerian gift to civilization that we still depend on today. For over 1,000 years, Sumerian civilization flourished. The early period, before 2900 BCE, saw the emergence of the first cities and the invention of writing. The early dynastic period, from 2900 to 2350 BCE, was the classical age of Sumerian city-states, each ruled by its own king, competing and cooperating, fighting wars over water rights and trade routes, creating magnificent art and architecture, and developing literature and learning. Archaeological evidence from this period shows sophisticated urban planning, advanced metallurgy, long-distance trade networks reaching to the Indus Valley and Afghanistan, and social complexity including priests, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and slaves. The royal tombs of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed astonishing wealth, golden headdresses, lapis lazuli inlays, silver lyres, and evidence of elaborate death rituals, including human sacrifice, where dozens of retainers were buried alive with their rulers, apparently willingly to their deaths, poisoned by some drug, and arranged in neat rows as if sleeping. But Sumer's political fragmentation was both its strength and its weakness. Competition between city-states drove innovation and cultural achievement, but it also made Sumer vulnerable to conquest by more unified neighbors. Around 2350 BCE, Sargon of Akkad, ruler of a Semitic-speaking people to the north, conquered the Sumerian city-states and created the world's first empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The Akkadians adopted Sumerian culture wholesale, using Cuneiform writing for their own language, worshipping Sumerian gods, and employing Sumerian scribes and administrators. Sumerian culture survived conquest, but Sumerian political independence did not. For the next 400 years, Sumer was ruled by Akkadian kings, though Sumerian remained the language of learning and religion, much as Latin would function in medieval Europe. Around 2100 BCE, Sumerian culture experienced a remarkable renaissance under the third dynasty of Ur, known as Ur III. For the 12th century, Sumerian kings ruled a reunited realm, creating what may have been history's first true bureaucratic state. The Ur III administration was obsessively documented, producing hundreds of thousands of clay tablets recording every detail of state operations, worker assignments, rations distributed, sheep counted, fields measured, sulfur weighed. This vast paper trail gives us an incredibly detailed picture of Sumerian society in its final flowering, revealing a centralized command economy where the state controlled agriculture, industry, and trade with an efficiency that would not be matched until the modern era. But this administrative achievement came at a cost. The system was rigid, inflexible, and demanding, requiring enormous labor, including large numbers of workers, in conditions approaching slavery. The burden grew unsustainable. Around 2004 BCE, disaster struck. The Elamites, a people from what is now southwestern Iran, sacked Ur, destroying the city and carrying the last Sumerian king into captivity. The Ur III state collapsed, and with it ended the last period of Sumerian political power. Over the following centuries, Semitic peoples, particularly the Amorites, became politically dominant in Mesopotamia. The Sumerian language gradually disappeared from daily use, surviving only as a learned language of religion and scholarship, like Latin in medieval Europe or Sanskrit in India. By 1800 BCE, probably no one spoke Sumerian as a native language anymore. The people who had invented writing had fallen silent. Their cities were abandoned or occupied by others. Their language became dead, known only to educated scribes who studied it as classical learning. Within a few more centuries, even that would be forgotten. But Sumerian influence did not die with the Sumerian language. The Babylonians and Assyrians, who dominated Mesopotamia for the next 2,000 years, considered themselves heirs to Sumerian civilization. They continued to use cuneiform writing, adapting it to their Semitic languages. They worshipped the same gods under different names. They studied Sumerian literature in their schools, copying and preserving Sumerian texts, creating bilingual Sumerian-Akkadian dictionaries to help students learn the ancient language. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though composed in Sumerian, was translated into Akkadian and became the most copied literary work in the ancient Near East, read from Egypt to Anatolia. Sumerian mathematical and astronomical knowledge was preserved and expanded by Babylonian scholars. Sumerian law codes influenced all subsequent Near Eastern law, including the famous Code of Hammurabi. Sumerian religious concepts, including creation myths and flood stories, spread throughout the region and influenced later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Sumerian legacy was woven so deeply into Mesopotamian civilization that it remained foundational even after the Sumerian people and language had vanished. Yet, ultimately, even this indirect Sumerian influence faded. Mesopotamian civilization itself eventually fell. The Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, and though they maintained much Mesopotamian culture, cuneiform writing began its slow decline. The Greeks, under Alexander the Great, conquered the region in 331 BCE, bringing Greek language and culture. Gradually, cuneiform fell out of use, replaced by alphabetic Aramaic and later Arabic scripts. The last cuneiform text was written around 75 CE, over 3,000 years after the Sumerians first impressed symbols into clay. After that, cuneiform became unreadable, its meaning lost. The great cities of Sumer crumpled and were buried under desert sands and wind-blown dirt. Babylon, Ur, Uruk, Nippur became shapeless mounds in the Iraqi desert. The very existence of Sumerian civilization was forgotten, surviving only as confused references in Greek and Hebrew texts that mentioned Babylon and the Tower of Babel, but knew nothing of the Sumerians, who had created the civilization Babylon inherited. For 2,000 years, Sumer slept beneath the sand, silent and forgotten. Then, in the 19th century, European adventurers and archaeologists began excavating in the rock, drawn by biblical references to Babylon and Nineveh. In the 1840s and 50s, British and French excavators discovered the Assyrian palaces at Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad, finding thousands of clay tablets covered in strange wedge-shaped marks. Scholars slowly deciphered this cuneiform script, first cracking Old Persian cuneiform, then using trilingual inscriptions to decode Akkadian, the Semitic language of the Assyrians and Babylonians. But as they translated more tablets, they encountered a puzzle. Many texts contained vocabulary and grammar that did not fit Semitic patterns. They appeared to be written in a completely different, unknown language. The solution came gradually. Scholars realized they were looking at bilingual texts, with Semitic Akkadian translations of works in an older, non-Semitic language. This mysterious language was Sumerian, and its discovery was like finding a civilization that had been completely erased from human memory. The Sumerians were not mentioned in the Bible, in Greek sources, or in any known historical text. They had vanished so completely that their very existence had been forgotten. Yet here were their words preserved in clay, waiting 4,000 years to be read again. The decipherment of Sumerian was extraordinarily difficult, because it was a language isolate, unrelated to any known language family, with no living descendants or relatives. There was no Rosetta Stone for Sumerian. Scholars had to work backward from Akkadian translations, comparing texts, identifying word patterns, gradually reconstructing grammar and vocabulary through painstaking analysis. The process took decades, and even today, aspects of Sumerian grammar remain debated. As excavations continued into the 20th century, the scope of Sumerian achievement became clear. Between 1922 and 1934, Leonard Woolley excavated Ur, discovering the royal tombs with their spectacular golden treasures and revealing a sophisticated urban civilization dating back to 2600 BCE. German archaeologists excavated Uruk, finding the earliest writing and monumental architecture, French teams worked at Lagash and Tello. Iraqi archaeologists excavated numerous sites after independence. Together, these excavations recovered hundreds of thousands of clay tablets, spanning 2,000 years of Sumerian history. We now know more about Sumerian daily life than about many much later civilizations, because the Sumerians wrote everything down, and clay tablets, when fired in accidental fires or deliberately baked, become virtually indestructible. A clay tablet buried for 4,000 years emerges from the ground as readable at the day it was written, its cuneiform impressions as crisp as ever. These tablets revealed a civilization of stunning sophistication. Sumerian mathematics was highly advanced, using a place-value number system thousands of years before similar systems appeared elsewhere. They understood sophisticated geometry, algebra, and even had early concepts of calculus. Their astronomical observations were precise enough to predict planetary movements and eclipses. Their medical texts describe diagnoses and treatments showing empirical observation and systematic thinking. Their literature includes love songs, lullabies, funeral laments, wisdom literature, myths, and epics that reveal complex human psychology and philosophical depth. Personal letters reveal humor, affection, family dynamics, and concerns remarkably similar to our own. A father complains about his lazy son, who wastes time in the public square instead of studying. A wife begs her traveling husband to return home. A student writes about his struggles in scribe school and his gratitude to a dedicated teacher. Across 4,000 years, Sumerian voices speak to us, recognizably human, in their joys, sorrows, ambitions, and frustrations. The physical remains of Sumer tell equally compelling stories. The ziggurat at Ur still stands, its massive mud brick core surviving millennia. The royal tombs reveal sophisticated metalworking, including techniques like granulation and filigree that jewelers still use today. Cylinder seals, small carved stones rolled across wet clay to create identifying marks, show extraordinary artistic skill, depicting myths and daily life in miniature. Statues with enormous eyes show Sumerians at prayer, gazing eternally toward their gods. Clay tablets preserve not just text, but the fingerprints of scribes who handled them 4,000 years ago, a tangible physical connection across the millennia. Modern archaeological techniques have revolutionized our understanding of Sumer. Satellite imagery has identified thousands of ancient settlement sites across southern Iraq. Remote sensing reveals buried structures without excavation. Chemical analysis of residues tells us what ancient pots contained and what foods Sumerians ate. DNA analysis of ancient bones is beginning to reveal the genetic origins of the Sumerian people, though political instability in Iraq has made such research difficult. Computational analysis of the hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets has revealed economic patterns, social networks, and administrative structures in unprecedented detail. We know more about Sumerian civilization now than at any point since it fell, and every year brings new discoveries and insights. Yet much about Sumer remains mysterious. Who were the Sumerians? Where did they come from? The Sumerian language is unrelated to any other known language, suggesting they were either a very isolated population or that they migrated from somewhere distant, though where remains unknown. Genetic studies so far suggest they were similar to other ancient Middle Eastern populations, but firm conclusions await more extensive research. Why did Sumerian culture develop so rapidly in the late 4th millennium BCE? What sparked the sudden flowering of urbanism, writing, art, and complex society? The archaeological record shows the transformation happening within a few centuries, remarkably fast by archaeological standards, but the causes remain debated. Was it environmental change, population pressure, technological innovation, or some combination of factors? And why did Sumerian civilization ultimately disappear? Unlike many ancient civilizations destroyed by conquest or catastrophe, Sumer faded gradually, absorbed by neighbors who admired and imitated Sumerian culture, even as they displaced Sumerian language and political power. Some scholars point to environmental degradation. Intensive irrigation caused soil salinization, reducing agricultural productivity and undermining the economic base of Sumerian cities. Ancient texts complain about increasing salinity, declining yields. Others emphasize political factors. The constant warfare between city-states weakens Sumer, making it vulnerable to conquest by more unified neighbors. Still others note that Sumerian linguistic isolation may have been a handicap in an increasingly interconnected Mesopotamia where Semitic languages dominated. Probably all these factors played roles in Sumer's decline, creating a complex cascade of causes rather than a single explanation. What would the Sumerians think if they knew their civilization would be completely forgotten for 2,000 years, then rediscovered and celebrated as the fountainhead of human civilization? They wrote for eternity, pressing their thoughts into clay meant to last forever, yet they vanished from human memory more completely than they could have imagined. But they also succeeded beyond what they could have known. Every time we write anything, we use a technology the Sumerians invented. Every time we check the time in hours and minutes of 60, we use Sumerian mathematics. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the story of Noah's flood, we encounter stories the Sumerians told. The wheel, bronze, cities, schools, hospitals, courts of law. These Sumerian innovations still shape our world. In the most fundamental sense, we are all heirs to Sumerian civilization, living in a world they created. Today, the land of Sumer is once again troubled. Iraq's ancient sites have suffered terribly from modern conflicts. Looting, destruction by ISI, and collateral damage from warfare have caused incalculable losses. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which houses many of the world's finest Sumerian artifacts, was looted in 2003, though many items have since been recovered. Many ancient tell sites remain unexcavated, their contents unknown and vulnerable. Climate change and water management issues threaten sites just as irrigation and salinization challenged ancient Sumer. The political situation makes systematic archaeology difficult. Yet Iraqi archaeologists, often working in dangerous conditions with minimal resources, continue the work of recovering their country's extraordinary heritage. International cooperation has resumed at some sites. New discoveries continue, including caches of tablets still being translated and understood. The Sumerian legacy also faces challenges of interpretation and representation. Early scholars, influenced by Victorian attitudes and biblical frameworks, often misunderstood or misrepresented Sumerian culture. The image of Sumer has been shaped by Western museums that acquired Sumerian artifacts under colonial circumstances, raising ongoing questions about cultural property and repatriation. Popular culture often confuses Sumer with Babylon, or reduces its achievements to footnotes in biblical archaeology. Pseudo-archaeology has appropriated Sumerian civilization for theories about ancient aliens and lost advanced technology, distorting public understanding. Serious scholars work to counter these misrepresentations, presenting Sumerian civilization in its true complexity as a human achievement, remarkable enough without embellishment. What lessons does Sumer hold for us today? The Sumerians showed that civilization is not inevitable, but created, built by human ingenuity in response to human needs. They demonstrated that innovation can emerge from practical problems, that accounting concerns can lead to writing, that pottery wheels can become vehicle wheels, that administrative necessity can spark intellectual revolution. They prove that urbanization and complex society are possible but fragile, dependent on maintaining environmental and social systems that can collapse if mismanaged. The salinization that helped destroy Sumerian agriculture stands as an early warning about environmental degradation from intensive exploitation, a lesson we are still learning. Sumer's political fragmentation, both source of creative diversity and cause of military vulnerability, resonates with questions about unity versus independence that remain relevant. Most fundamentally, Sumer reminds us that memory is fragile and preservation is vital. A civilization that dominated its world for 2,000 years, that created innovations still used today, that produced literature of lasting beauty and wisdom, was completely forgotten for 2 millennia. Only because the Sumerians wrote on durable clay could they speak to us again across the void. How much else has been lost? What civilizations vanished without trace? And what of our own time will survive? In an age of digital information stored on fragile media and platforms that may not last decades, let alone millennia, the Sumerians' clay tablets offer both reassurance and warning. They remind us we can speak to the future, but only if we choose durable media and invest in preservation. The Sumerians wrote for eternity and succeeded, though not in ways they anticipated. What are we writing for the distant future? In the dusty ruins of ancient Ur, in the museums of Baghdad, London, Paris, and Philadelphia, in university libraries where scholars study cuneiform texts, in the digital databases where tablets are being cataloged and translated, the Sumerians speak still. Their words, pressed into clay by hands that turned to dust 4,000 years ago, continue to teach, inspire, and challenge us. They remind us that human civilization is ancient, that we stand on foundations laid by countless previous generations, that the innovations we take for granted were hard-won achievements. They show us that civilizations rise and fall, that nothing is permanent, that even the mightiest cities turn to dust, but also that human achievement can echo across millennia, that words can outlast empires, that a people can be reborn through the memory and scholarship of those who come after. The Sumerians invented writing so they could remember how many jars of oil they had in the temple storeroom. In doing so, they gave humanity the power to defeat time itself, to send thoughts across the centuries, to build knowledge across generations, to create civilization that could grow beyond the limits of it. They gave us the ability to learn from the past and speak to the future. And then they themselves became the past, falling silent, forgotten, until archaeologists uncovered their words and gave voice again to humanity's first writers. In the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay beneath the desert sands of Iraq, the Sumerians wait still, ready to speak to anyone who learns to read their ancient script, sharing the thoughts, dreams, laws, and stories of the people who first learned to write, who invented civilization as we know it, and who then vanished into the silence they had worked so hard to escape, leaving behind only their words, pressed into clay, waiting across 4,000 years to be read again.